Now let's move to yet another area of intervention, which is disaster management. And we have Luc St-Pierre here today, who is the Senior Program Coordinator of the UN Platform for Space-Based Information for Disaster Management and Emergency Response. And his background as a geographer, so I think it's a very, very interesting professional point of view on this particular issue. And we know the humanitarian field is one of the fields that has done the most, actually, in applying some of these mapping technologies. Luc, you have the floor.
Francesco, if it's fine, I would rather... This room is a bit like a chapel, and my name is St-Pierre. I feel more comfortable here to preach for you. I don't have any presentation, though. And without starting a debate with my colleague of the UN, I would like you to appreciate that when we talk about humanitarian affairs, excluding peacekeeping, we're talking about a different UN in a way. Humanitarian agencies, and not only UN, but international organizations, don't have the resources or the means of the peacekeeping. So any development integration of new technologies is at a very different scale. Please appreciate this factor in my presentation. I will not talk much about technologies and innovation, actually, but more in the context we're working as actors of humanitarian affairs. What are the constraints and what maybe we should be looking for in terms of improving their use or increasing their use. I will not talk much I will not talk about all the sectors of humanitarian affairs. As Francesco mentioned, I'm coordinator of a program called SPIDER, which deals mostly with remote sensing for disaster management and emergency response. We are not mandated to assist countries in improving their capabilities in conflicts, in population displacements. We are looking at disaster risk reduction and emergency response for disaster of natural causes or natural hazards. So more specific. I would, however, refer you to the World Disaster Report of last year, 2013, published by IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, which focused last year on technology and the future of human intervention. You will find there a wealth of examples, practices, tests that were done in different organizations dealing with every aspect of humanitarian affairs. The context we're working in, SPIDER and other agencies are mandated, obviously, to work priority in developing countries, where we find a very weak governance structure when it comes to disaster risk reduction, emergency response, to the management of geographic information in general. The human resources and financial resources, as you know, are very highly insufficient, but there's also a lack in many countries of a long-term vision on to how to develop and consolidate and sustain those resources. Very often, and maybe that's the link with the previous speakers, most of the actions that we have to facilitate or support take place in countries where the population suffering from disasters are also suffering from conflicts, which makes the impacts much bigger, but which makes also the actions much more difficult to take. The security is an issue, displacement, access are always issues. In terms of information, the core data sets are either completely missing, incomplete, inaccurate, poorly organized, not accessible, and even worse, they're not shared at all. So those are the usual, the context we're working with. So SPIDER, with that perspective, SPIDER wants to ensure that all countries, international, regional organizations have access to and develop the capacity to use all type of space-based information. Big word to say, remote sensing, Earth observation data mostly. And very importantly, to support the full disaster management cycle. And I'm insisting on the word full. I will get back to that later. What we do, we're not operational in the sense that we won't mobilize teams, we won't set instruments or tools or develop or do research, but we'll provide advisory services to our member states on how they can improve their capabilities in accessing and managing information that can be useful to them. We do that by developing good practices in knowledge management, information sharing, data exchange practices and all that. We're also very active in trying to bridge communities involved with responsibility or authorities in disaster management or emergency response. I always say the two because they are technical distinctions, but you get the grasp of it. Those communities can be space agencies, national, regional, private companies who are operating satellites, for example, who are acquiring, selling, distributing satellite imagery. They might be part of international mechanism to make that imagery accessible, free of charge in case of disaster. They can be provider of global navigation system for navigation and geoposition. They can be also provider of satellite telecommunication services, which are important also in both early warning aspects and response. I mentioned, I referred earlier to the full disaster cycle or disaster management cycle. You've seen and you may probably involve also in activities where technologies are useful, tested, or used in terms of emergency response. At the onset of a disaster, earthquake, floods, tsunami, or later on. But there are probably more applications, more interest in developing those technologies and those tools for preparedness, mitigation, early warning prior to a possible disaster. A little bit like Elena told us about this early warning for conflicts. There are many applications from these space-based applications that are being developed, implemented, but probably face more constraints. At different time between preparedness and response and recovery, you will find different actors, okay? Maybe different government authorities, different NGOs working. They will need different type of data, they will need different type of information, different scale, different resolution. And the solutions have to be adapted to these different things. And that's what we're working on mostly, trying to characterize what is needed at what time and by whom, and working with the governments to help them develop that governance structure that will help them develop the capabilities. I can take the example, I mean, when we think of natural hazard and disasters, we think of earthquakes, tsunamis, and floods. Actually, the most important damaging and in terms of lives and resources type of disasters are floods and drought, and not independently. The combined effect of floods and droughts is becoming the main threats to the whole world. But both are treated differently. Most of the governed countries will have different authorities responsible for floods. Those would be water institutes, hydrologic, meteorological services, than those responsible for droughts, which would be Ministry of Agriculture, for example. So if you don't have the governance structure for those institutions to work together, to interchange data, to work together at acquiring more information, at developing their human resource capacity, the dual disaster of drought and floods will never be well managed. So it's not necessarily since I was at UNHCR before doing refugee camp mapping with remote sensing and mobile data collection. The tools are there, the technology exists, okay? And it's not the UN who's developing it, but we're, contrary to, again, to Ms. Ack earlier, saying that the UN is behind development. As a system it is, but believe me, in the field, at the mid-level management level, the capacity is there. There's so much good ideas, there's so much initiative. So it's a matter of arranging the system to be more in line with the development. So just to say that, to me, the tools exist. It's easy to grab something that functions, that works, that is accessible, that might be free even. But to make it work in a country where the conditions are not present, where the education level is not there, where the technical capacities is not there, where professional staff who might have access to a master's degree in Europe will have to find that themselves. They will find the grant themselves. They might have to resign for their job to go and study and then find something else later. There are very few institutions with which we work that have a human resource development program. How do you manage to get resources to send your staff to that training to make sure that they will come back and work with you and that the training will be well targeted? So it's really not the technology for me that are the problem, it's the context to make it useful. And be it satellite telecommunication, for example, we use that every day, but very often the responders need satellite telecommunication from the onset of a disaster because mobile networks are the first one to fall down. it's also useful for data transfer. So again, the technologies in private sector, in government institution exist in many countries, but not easily adaptable in the field. Mobile technologies, again at UNHCR, we started to develop a few years back mobile data collections, doing surveys in refugee camps on trying to replace older technology using paper. That is being used now much more widely. But again, the constraints we were facing were not technological, they were not financial. It was the head of a refugee camp that said, why should I invest in buying 10 cellular phones, installing a server for these services, when with that money I can buy 500 jerry cans and build 20 tents and maybe hire a doctor for a few months. So again, the context is not always favorable to the implementation of these tools. Global navigation system is also one of the space-based applications that is essential. You use your GPS and your car on your phone every day, and we think that those services exist and it's free and it's fine. Most of the regions where we have to work, the coverage of GPS or other GNSS services is very weak, is not accurate enough. The coverage is not perfect. So working with private sector who are providers of services is important to make sure to identify as UN what are the priorities, what are the hot areas, the hot spots that we need to work, and where this is important. So that also GNSS services can be developed by private companies in those countries. If there is no good services, you will not see the realm of application that you have here, for example, in Europe. So those services need to be developed. And that's where UN agencies are working. We're trying to promote that. And when I said earlier that SPIDER tries to develop bridges between communities, that's what we do. We had a workshop last year where we had crowdsource and crisis mapper communities sitting with space agencies and provider of GNSS and say, this is what we can do, but the products that you're making available are useless to us. They're not timely. That's not what we want. Space community will say, yeah, crowdsourcing is good, but we don't know about the data quality. We sat together for 3 days and open up a little bit the discussion, and it helped. It's far from being finished. The main tool, though, is Earth observation tools, remote sensing data. SPIDER program focuses on remote sensing, meaning from space platforms. There are, of course, in humanitarian sector, the use of UAVs. We saw that, even of balloons. But again, when I say there's a different UN within the humanitarian affairs, when we talk about UAVs for camp mapping or emergency response, we talk about machine of 50, 70 centimeters that are hand-launched, controlled with a mobile phone, and that costs $15,000. So not high altitude, permanently flying UAVs collecting lots of data. It's a very different context. And when I tried to use UAVs in Eastern Chad in 2008, I think with a private research company, research spin-off at the University of Lausanne, we were ready to try it in the field. We never got the clearance to import immigration customs in the country. And then the security officer told us, this is great, I love that tool. They were with us on a demonstration. If you fly that in a refugee camp in Eastern Chad, it will be shut down by rebels in about 10 minutes. So the conditions, the field conditions, again, are not always there for technologies. And you have to understand, to assess, and observe a little bit what is possible. So in terms of satellite imagery, I will finish soon. There's obviously more and more high-resolution imagery, meaning you can see smaller objects and map at a much higher level of details. The coarser or the more refined, the more highest resolution you get, the more expensive it is. And it's not always the best tool. We spend quite a bit of energy. I was in Central America a few weeks ago, and we had quite a hot discussion with the Minister of Environment. He wanted to have high-resolution imagery over El Salvador because it's a small country, and sorry, you don't have the money, you don't have the resources to analyze it, you don't have the storage capacity for that kind of volume. Don't forget medium resolution, low resolution imagery that are free of charge, that could be extremely useful to do land use mapping, land use changes, which is critical in terms of identifying risk. Vulnerability mapping, you don't need high resolution. There are a range of solutions that are accessible that needs to be exploited. We talk about radar imagery, which is not dependent to cloud cover, to night or day, but again, the processing of that is more complex, the analysis, the understanding of those products. So you need the local, the national capacity to use those things. There's no point in pushing for these technologies to be further developed if we cannot assimilate what exists already. Same thing with micro or nano or cube satellites. They're becoming almost a nuisance in a way, because it will increase drastically the traffic in space. Our Office for Outer Space Affairs deals with the long-term sustainability of space, trying to have rules on these microsatellites. There are all kinds of issues that hinder a little bit the expansion of those technologies. Elevation model, again, very quickly. We have access to free elevation models, which are critical to produce risk map, flood maps. But what is available now is at 90 meters. Some providers are starting to make available elevation model at 10 meters, 5 meters, which can become useful in a place like Bangladesh, for example, where the denivellation is very small. But the cost, the volume of data, the technology is still very expensive. So we're working as a group, I say group because there are interagency efforts within the UN to work with these providers. Just to finish, I will talk about some risk about technological innovation. I refer to some examples, and we heard about different cases. Data sensitivity is critical, and even more so when we start working with volunteer group. What we can do, how we screen, we filter, we disseminate information is critical. Big data, we heard different examples of big data. What I can add to it, one of the risk is that there is too much data, of course, by definition. If we look at the case of the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, I believe, there were hundreds of maps produced every day by different organizations, agencies. Less than 1% of those maps were useful in the field. There was a survey saying this looks good on my wall, but it's useless in the field. Target the needs, understand the user requirement, understand the local capacity, and what is really needed is critical. And again, just to finish in conclusions, Ms. Ack mentioned the need for education at the professional level, at the technical level, starting at the secondary level in developing countries. We need to facilitate, to have programs promoting the development of those technologies, research and testing in country itself. And prioritize, as I said earlier, there's no point in having good ideas that will cost $10,000 in cell phones if the needs in health education are not fulfilled. So we need to prioritize and convince also. Thank you.
Thank you, Luc. Thank you very much. Incidentally, I mean, I see so many synergies between the things that you are doing, SPADER is doing, and what we were talking before in peace operation. And maybe one of the things that also the SPADER group can do is looking into the UN system and what already exists and what can be moved to other part of the system.